Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and soon after the Battle of Chancellorsville ended, Thomas Stonewall Jackson passed away. James Longstreet and Robert E. Lee would then plan their second invasion of the North. On May 9, 1863, James Longstreet arrived near the winter quarters of the Army of Northern Virginia and its leader, Robert E. Lee. The two men discussed the events that transpired during the Battle of Chancellorsville and Jackson's wounding. Lee was obviously concerned about his wounded corps commander. The next day, a little after 3 p.m., Jackson would pass away. Without the commander of the 2nd Corps, Lee now turned solely to Longstreet to discuss the upcoming campaign. Longstreet, after the war, devoted numerous pages describing the meetings he had with Lee from May 11th to the 13th. It was during those meetings that they constructed what would become known as the Gettysburg Campaign. During those meetings, Longstreet proposed again to send 2 divisions of his corps and himself to Tennessee, combine that force with the Army of Tennessee and Joseph E. Johnston's troops, overpower the Army of the Cumberland near Nashville, then invade Kentucky and threaten Cincinnati. Longstreet believed that was the only way to stop the capitulation of Vicksburg. When Lee suggested an invasion into Pennsylvania, Longstreet believed the campaign would take too long and Vicksburg would fall before it concluded. Longstreet would say later that it became useless and improper to offer suggestions leading to a different course. All that I could ask was that the policy of the campaign should be one of defensive tactics, that we should work so as to force the enemy to attack us in such a good position as we might find in his own country, so well adapted to that purpose which might assure us of a grand triumph. To this he readily assented as an important and material adjunct to his general plan. Despite his caveats to Lee's plan, a contemporary letter written to Senator Wigfall reveals Longstreet's confidence in an invasion of Pennsylvania. He said, "If we could cross the Potomac with 150,000 men, I think we could demand Lincoln to declare his purpose. If it is a Christian purpose, enough of blood has been shed to satisfy any principles. If he intends extermination, we should know it at once and play a little at that game whilst we can." Longstreet saw the value in taking the war into the North, and these statements reveal that he was not as Western-centric as his later writings may have alluded. Lee would travel to Richmond to meet with President Davis and the cabinet members and remain there from May 14th to the 18th. The cabinet voted in favor of the invasion. Before the Army of Northern Virginia marched off for Pennsylvania, Lee reorganized the army. He had thought hard about it even before Jackson's death, but now, with the general's death, it was the perfect time. He would replace Jackson with Richard Ewell and create another corps, the 3rd Corps, and give it to A.P. Hill. Furthermore, Lee took divisions from the 1st and 2nd Corps to create the 3rd. Longstreet's reorganized corps would be composed of the divisions of Lafayette McLaws, John Bell Hood, and George Pickett. Longstreet agreed with the placement of Richard Ewell to corps commander, but thought less of A.P. Hill, who he saw as inferior to Ewell. Longstreet preferred placing D.H. Hill in command of the 3rd Corps. Lee had grown disappointed in Lafayette McLaws's generalship. Illness made his performance at Chancellorsville lackluster, and the army commander asked Longstreet to inquire of his division commander's health and see if he would be open to other service. McLaws said his health was fine and resisted reassignment, even after Longstreet offered to send him further south and possibly switch the division commander with Beauregard, who would come to Northern Virginia with a corps to help during the summer. Nevertheless, McLaws stayed. However, because he stayed, Lee made it clear to Longstreet that any mistake McLaws made during the campaign, that Longstreet would be held responsible. Longstreet affirmed that he understood and promised to give personal attention to the division and its commander. This shift in relationship between Longstreet and McLaws would be the start of a rift between the two men. On June 3rd, the Army of Northern Virginia began marching north. Before the campaign, Lee would write about his army that the country cannot overestimate its worth. There never were such men in any army before and never can be again. If properly led, they will go anywhere and never fail at the work before them. The march was quick and brutal in the summer heat. Longstreet crossed and recrossed the Shenandoah River to support Stuart's cavalry as they guarded the gaps in the Blue Ridge, providing a screening movement for the army. As Longstreet surveyed his troops, an officer said that the general must be tired. Longstreet responded, "No, I have never felt fatigue in my life." As the army marched north, Lee accompanied Longstreet. They stayed close, with Lee seeking the general's advice through every phase of the campaign. By June 27th, part of the army had made it to Chambersburg. The town flooded with soldiers, and Longstreet and Lee made their headquarters in a grove of trees outside the town known as Shatter's Woods. On the march, a British observer named Arthur Fremantle, part of the Coldstream Guards, attached himself to Longstreet's staff. He wrote of Lee and Longstreet, "The relations between him and Longstreet are quite touching. They are almost always together. Longstreet's corps complain of this sometimes, as they say that they seldom get a chance of detached service, which falls to the lot of Ewell. It is impossible to please Longstreet more than by praising Lee. I believe these two generals to be as little ambitious and as thoroughly unselfish as any men in the world." On June 28th, with the absence of Jeb Stuart's cavalry, Lee and Longstreet got their first piece of solid intelligence about the Union Army. Harrison the scout, paid in gold coins at the beginning of the month by Longstreet, had found Longstreet's headquarters and reported that the Union Army was on the move through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. Upon hearing the news, Lee recalled Ewell from Carlisle in order to concentrate his forces. On the 30th, Lee and Longstreet moved eastward toward Cashtown, and they set up their headquarters near a deserted sawmill. Lee made the statement earlier in the day that, "Tomorrow, gentlemen, we will not move to Harrisburg as we expected, but will go over to Gettysburg and see what General Meade is after." On July 1st, the two armies engaged at the little town of Gettysburg. Longstreet, Lee, and Fremantle advanced along the Chambersburg pike, and as they rode along, men from Edward Johnson's division of Ewell's corps, who had never seen Longstreet, got close to the general. When some Floridians saw Longstreet, they cried out, "Look out for work now, boys, for here's the old bulldog again." As the generals got closer to the battle, Longstreet observed the Federals regrouping on high ground beyond the town. He commented to Lee that, "We could not call the enemy to position better suited to our plans. All that we have to do is file around his left and secure good ground between him and his capital." Lee did not like that idea and jabbed his fist into his hand, saying, "If the enemy is there tomorrow, we must attack him." Longstreet responded, "If he is there, it will be because he is anxious that we should attack him, a good reason, in my judgment, for not doing so." Longstreet's proposal to move between the Union Army and the capital was impracticable at that moment. Lee did not know where the Union Army was. In fact, many of the corps were on their way to Gettysburg, which means a movement in that direction would put them in collision with the rest of the Union Army. For that moment, Lee's directive for an attack the next day was the better course of action. Longstreet bedded down beside the road where his divisions rested. One could only imagine he got little sleep as he dreaded an attack the next day.